Hello, composers! As always, begin the week by going over the pieces your classmates created last week and filling out the feedback forms. Continuing on with the ideas of independence and interdependence, this week will be a very brief introduction to Counterpoint. Keep in mind that these are really general things we're going to be going over. In fact, Counterpoint is an entirely separate class. And if you go on to grad school for composition in particular, you'll have at least a full year of it in most programs. At its most simple definition, counterpoint is the setting of two or more completely independent melodies with the same durations at the exact same time. Historically, one of these melodies is a pre-composed tune called the cantus firmus, and the second melody is a newly composed one. It sounds easy. The key, though, is that the intervals between these two melodies are always consonant. Any perfect interval, but remember, in some schools of thought, the fourth can be considered a dissonance, and all major or minor thirds and sixths. Seconds, sevenths, and the tritone are always dissonant and to be avoided. This results in a constant stream of consonant notes from the beginning to the end of the line. Additionally, the voices move primarily by step or small leaps, usually under a fifth, although an octave can be okay in some circumstances. Here's an example. This is just a simple example of a two-voice, one-to-one duration piece of counterpoint. Since the notes are always of the same duration and always in this ratio of 1-to-1, this is what's known as first species counterpoint. Note the inclusion of numbers between the parts. These indicate the intervals, but not necessarily their quality. Quality is things like if it's major, minor, augmented, or diminished. This allows the person writing the counterpoint to quickly check and make sure that there are no dissonant intervals, or to avoid the dreaded parallel fifths and octaves. In writing these numbers, you always count up from the bass note and condense down to within an octave, so you'll have numbers 1 through 8 usually, although it's very common to go up to a ninth or 10th rather than condensing these intervals down to a second and third respectively. By tradition, in counterpoint, there are a number of different types of motion. Parallel, where the voices both move in the same direction by the same interval. This is very common for thirds and sixths. Similar motion, where they move in the same direction, but not by the same interval. Think of a sixth moving to a third. Contrary motion, where the voices move in opposite directions. And finally, oblique motion, where one voice stays on the same pitch and the other voice moves away from it. All of these types of motion are okay in and of themselves, but parallel fifths and octaves are to be avoided at all costs. This is because they're harmonically static intervals. There's nowhere for them to go. So having a parallel fifth or a parallel octave really kills the sense of motion in the piece. In fact, if you take the actual counterpoint class, you'll spend most of your time working to avoid just these parallel intervals. Of course, it gets exponentially harder the more voices you add in. When you expand to 4 voices, you'll have to check the intervals between soprano and alto, soprano and tenor, soprano and bass, alto and tenor, alto and bass, and tenor and bass. That's 6 different relationships that you have to keep track of just moving from one 4-note chord to another. Let's move on to second species. We've been working with a 1-to-1 ratio, but let's change that so that one voice now has twice the notes to the other, a 2-to-1 ratio. Here, if one voice is moving in half notes, the other will move in quarters. Or if one is moving in quarters, the other will move by eighths. Let's look at some Bach for this. The chorale melody with figured bass, number 14, measures 1 through 4. In this example, the cantus firmus is not in the bass. It's actually in the upper voice. Here we see the bass moving constantly by eighths and occasionally stopping on a quarter at cadential points of rest. Totally fine in second species, by the way. The soprano moves almost entirely by quarters with the occasional dotted quarter or eighth, which we'll ignore for now. It's Bach. He can break the rules. Let's take a look at the intervals. Note that there are now some dissonant intervals, but they primarily occur on weak beats, where only the faster of the 2 parts is actually moving. However, they are always going to resolve to a consonant interval when both parts move in sync. This is a very important point. One thing that students get into trouble with is forgetting that these points where all the voices move together are going to occur on the strong beats and are thus harmonically more present to the listener. It's why you should never have an octave on beat 1 and an octave on beat 3. It doesn't matter that there's something between them in beat 2, even a dissonance, it's still effectively parallel octaves, and especially if they move in the same direction. This is enough to give you a taste of counterpoint, but there are more versions that become more and more difficult to write. Third species uses a ratio of 4-to-1 between the durations of 2 voices. Fourth species uses the same 1-to-1 ratio as in first species, but offset by half the duration. This forms an overlapping chain of suspension, resolution. And finally, fifth species, or mixed species, can employ any and all of the above. Bach generally tends to do the latter. And if you look at a random Bach work, you will find all of the different forms of species counterpoint at work. Particularly in this week's listening, the Crab Canon from Bach's Musical Offering.